Welcome to day 25 of Western Civilization. Our focus today is going to be on the French Revolution as part of the greater unit of revolutionary ideas. Now today you'll see that there are quite a few notable dates. 1789, storming of the Bastille. 1793 to 1794 is the Reign of Terror. 1802 is when an individual named Napoleon Bonaparte crowns himself as emperor. 1814, Napoleon gives up the throne. In 1821, Napoleon dies. Now, an overview of the French Revolution basically includes some of the similar ideals that we talked about with the American Revolution. A lot of it drew from inspiration from Enlightenment political thought. Now, France was the center of the Enlightenment, so therefore a lot of these ideals are circulating amongst its citizens. With that in mind, France is going to be much more radical than what the American Revolution was. Now, American revolutionaries sought their independence, but kept kind of their cultural heritage. The French leaders sought to replace the entire old system in almost every facet. So essentially we're talking about starting from scratch with the French Revolution. And that method or that degree of change is going to be extremely problematic for the French. Now let's talk about this. Now the root of the French Revolution has to do quite a bit with money in their economic system. So in the 1780s, half of the government's revenue was used to pay off war debts. Now France was in a huge debt from funding a lot of foreign conflicts. One of those specifically was the American Revolution. Now King Louis XVI was unable to raise a lot of the funds needed from the peasantry. So what he did is he sought to increase funds on the French nobility who had not previously paid levies or taxes in the past. So what happens? These aristocrats protested. They summoned what they called the Estates General that we'll talk about. I'll show you a graphic here in just a moment to meet to discuss this issue. Now they hadn't met since 1614, and the Estates General represented the French population. Now if we take a look here, the Estates General, or French social classes, was divided into three different estates. The first estate, which was about 100,000 people or so, was the Catholic clergy. The second estate were the nobles, and that was about 400,000 people. And the third estate, the vast majority, about 24 million, were peasants. Now each estate got one vote under the Estates General. Now what's ludicrous about this is that here you have the majority of the population as illustrated down here, alright, but each estate gets an equal say. So essentially what's going to happen is the first and second estates are going to gang up on the third estate, so they're always going to be for the most part outnumbered 2 to 1. Now as a majority you can see the problem that exists with this. Alright, so that's the population. Land ownership, you can take a look at this, 0.5%, the first estate, the clergy, 10% of the land. 1.5% of the population from the second estate, a quarter of the land, and the rest is kind of split up by the third estate. Okay? And what's even worse, if we take a look at the government taxation, 100% of the funds is going to come from, yep, you guessed it, the third estate or the commoners. Alright? That means that they are not helping or taxing in any way whatsoever. So you can see why the third estate is so upset at the economic infrastructure of France during this time. Best epitomized in this image right here, you can see this individual right here represents the third estate carrying the first and second estate. Now feel free to pause this and look at this. This is basically going to break down the French estate general system. So I won't take up your time by reading this to you, but please pause this and just kind of check it out. It should be an easier way to kind of understand the social class condition at this time. Now what was the motivation of the revolutionaries? So poverty and hunger were a huge thing. And in fact, lack of food is kind of what drove the revolution here. Low wages and fear of unemployment, heightened expectations to the exposure to a political perspective, a strong dislike and distrust for the wealthy. Alright? That kind of sounds familiar to you today, for the most part. So, the start of the revolution, let's get into it. Now, like we talked about, the Estates General was summoned. So in June 1789, representatives of the Third seceded from the Estates General. They didn't like kind of where that discussion was going. So what happened was the Estates General, which had been the majority of the population, became known as the National Assembly in June of 1789. And they wanted to really develop a constitution. So they swore in this meeting that they were not going to disband until a new constitution was created. They also wanted to abolish the old social order and fight for France becoming a constitutional monarchy, and using some of the private lands to use more so for the overall majority of the people. Okay, about a month later, July 14th, 1789, the National Assembly storms the Bastille, which is a royal jail. Now, the reason for doing this, and here's a picture of what this would have kind of looked like. The reason was that the Bastille was also a huge armory. So the National Assembly was able to get a lot of weapons to arm their cause. Now, the French nobility at this time sought assistance from other foreign powers to support the monarchy. Now, fearing a military defeat, the revolutionary leaders, like we talked about, abolished the old system of society, fought to make France a republic, and took over a lot of church lands as well. So they want the resources so that they can be a notable entity in fighting the French monarchy. Okay, further, in terms of reform, the Assembly adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in 1789. And essentially what's included in this is that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. They also have access to liberty, property, security, and the resistance to oppression. So essentially what this document guarantees is that citizens have equal justice, they have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and this is going to be something that's implemented for all citizens. This is very different from what the Declaration of Independence talked about in the American Revolution, where that was implied that more freedoms are given to powerful white male landowners in North America. Again, here's kind of an image of what this looks like, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And so if you can read some French, go ahead and have some fun with this. Otherwise, it's just kind of a depiction of what this would have looked like. Alright, in 1791, the National Assembly creates a limited constitutional monarchy. And what this does, it's going to strip the king, Louis XVI, of much of his power. He essentially only had the power to enforce laws, and that was kind of superficial at best. In addition, the 1791 Constitution developed the Legislative Assembly. And eventually, the Assembly is going to be split into three different groups: the Radicals, the Moderates, and the Conservatives. So the Radicals are going to oppose the idea of monarchy altogether. Moderates want some changes. The Conservatives uphold the idea of a limited monarchy. They don't mind it per se. And in fact, today when we talk about left, center, or right, it comes back to this right here, with the division within the Legislative Assembly. Now, if I may add, on a side note, you will see, and we talk about the French Revolution, a bunch of different constitutions that are developed. And what that's going to underscore is that the French Revolution was extremely chaotic. A lot of division, there's a lot of internal problems, and factional fighting as well. So if you get confused, I'm with you, but we'll get through it. Now, King Louis XVI is executed in 1793, and what this does is it opens up a wave of chaos that happens. This revolution is going to explode from here. So between 1793 and 1794, this period is known as the Reign of Terror. This is where a lot of people are going to be exposed to a very brutal death via guillotine. Now, the radical Jacobin party dominated the assembly, and they are led by an individual called Maximilien Robespierre. Now, these Jacobians believed and radical changes. Okay? They wanted a complete restructuring of France. They wanted to eliminate Christianity. They wanted to promote more of a cult of reason or logical thinking. They wanted to reorganize the entire calendar into starting with year one, 10-day units, and 100-minute hours. I mean, it was crazy. Okay, they wanted to wear working class clothes, fight for the rights of women, and so on and so forth. So they're talking extreme changes. Now, like we talked about with the Reign of Terror, it targeted a lot of enemies of the nation. Basically, anybody that could be perceived as an enemy was an enemy. This is going to be very similar to, without the guillotine obviously, kind of McCarthyism in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Now, it's estimated that about 40,000 people were executed by guillotine, including the person that invented the guillotine himself. 300,000 are imprisoned, so you can see how much it was kind of a reign of terror, extreme chaos. Now, with this instability, it really undermined the regime in power at that time, and eventually Robespierre was arrested and executed via guillotine. Now, the group that's going to take power and seize power and rule France is a small group of people known as the Directory. We'll talk about them here in just a moment. But if you take a look here, you can see kind of death by guillotine. All right. Now, one thing that you should kind of keep in mind and kind of note, that it's believed that once a person was guillotined, they still had some kind of conscious awareness of what was going on for anywhere from 4 to 8 minutes or so. They could still kind of look around. Obviously, they couldn't speak, but you know that while that blood was kind of rushing out of their head and stuff like that, they still could kind of maintain some limited brain function. Now, one of those people that was part of the Directory was an individual named Napoleon Bonaparte. And eventually he's going to stage a coup d'etat in 1799 to take power. And he's going to become the first consul of France. He will crown himself as emperor in 1802. And what Napoleon does is he brings stability to the region. Okay? So we have a return of seized lands from the earlier French Revolution. Christianity is recognized, and also the freedom of religion is implemented. Now, what Napoleon is able to do, once he has stability, he is able to take France from a very fragmented state to one that's very unified, and then expand its influence and borders. So you can take a look at this map. This is Napoleon's empire by 1810, and here's France, or the French Empire. These are countries that are controlled by Napoleon, and these are countries that are allied with Napoleon. So we can see that Napoleon very, very much dominated Europe without question. Now, he does have some enemies, or countries that are at war with Napoleon. The United Kingdom, Great Britain and Ireland, Portugal being one of those. And another one that he's going to cause is Russia. Now, Napoleon sought to extend his empire throughout Europe. The Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, the Netherlands, so on and so forth. He forced Austria, Prussia, and Russia to ally themselves with France. Now, kind of what his undoing was when he invaded Russia in 1812. He's going to capture Moscow, but he left in a destroyed city in the middle of winter. This is going to deplete a lot of his forces and really kind of weaken his military. Very similar to what's going to happen to Nazi Germany in World War II. So the result, what we see, is a coalition of British, Austrian, Prussian forces that force Napoleon to give up the throne. They're going to exile him to a small island called Elba in 1814. He is going to escape, reclaim power for about another 100 days before he's finally defeated by the British at Waterloo, which is in Belgium, before he is going to be exiled further from Europe into a small island called St. Helena in 1815. It's at that island that he is going to eventually die. And after Napoleon is disposed, the French nobility will return, so on and so forth. Thanks for tuning in.